The fever came on so suddenly that Priscilla Vance didn't even make it to the general store before her knees buckled on the dusty main street of Fort Laramie, Wyoming. One moment she was walking with purpose toward the mercantile, her worn leather satchel swinging at her side, and the next the world tilted sideways as waves of heat rolled through her body despite the crisp October air of 1878. She heard someone shout, felt strong arms catch her before she hit the ground, and then everything dissolved into fragments of consciousness punctuated by violent shivers and a cough that seemed to tear at her lungs. When Priscilla opened her eyes again, she found herself staring at rough-hewn wooden beams above her head instead of the familiar cracked plaster of her boarding house room. The light filtering through a small window told her it was either very early morning or late afternoon, but she had no idea which. Her body felt like it had been trampled by a herd of cattle, every muscle aching with a deep, persistent pain that made even breathing feel like work. She tried to sit up and managed to lift her head perhaps 2 inches before her strength gave out entirely and she fell back against the pillow with a weak gasp. "Easy now," a deep voice said from somewhere to her left. "You have been fighting a high fever for 3 days straight. Your body needs rest, not heroics." Priscilla turned her head slowly toward the voice, the simple movement requiring far more effort than it should have. A man sat in a wooden chair beside the bed, his long legs stretched out in front of him and his weathered boots crossed at the ankle. He was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it brushed his collar, and eyes the color of strong coffee. His face was tanned from long hours in the sun, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though at the moment his expression was serious and watchful. He wore a simple cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms and a leather vest that had seen better days. "Who are you?" Priscilla managed to whisper, her throat feeling like she had swallowed sand. "Ethan Dalton," he replied, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. "I caught you when you collapsed on Main Street 3 days ago. Doc Harrison said you have the influenza that has been sweeping through the territory. He wanted to take you to the infirmary, but they already have 12 people packed in there, and he was worried you would catch something worse on top of what you already have. So I brought you here to my place instead." "Your place," Priscilla repeated faintly, trying to process this information through the fog in her mind. "I should not be here. It is not proper." "What is not proper is letting a woman die in the street because of social conventions," Ethan said firmly, "and you very nearly did die, Miss Vance. Your fever spiked so high on the second night that Doc Harrison thought we might lose you. He stayed here all night putting cold compresses on your forehead and neck, trying to bring your temperature down." Priscilla closed her eyes, mortification washing over her along with another wave of exhaustion. She was 22 years old, had been living independently in Fort Laramie for 6 months, and prided herself on being capable and self-sufficient. The idea that she had been completely helpless and dependent on strangers for 3 days was almost harder to bear than the physical discomfort. "I am sorry for the trouble," she whispered. "It is not trouble," Ethan said, and something in his voice made her open her eyes again to look at him. His expression had softened slightly, though his eyes remained intense. "You needed help. That is what neighbors do in a place like this. We help each other. I do not even know you." "Well, we can remedy that," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I am Ethan Dalton, as I mentioned. I have a cattle ranch about 2 miles outside of town, but I keep this small house here in Fort Laramie for when I need to conduct business or when the weather makes the ride back to the ranch impractical. I am originally from Texas, came up here about 5 years ago looking for better grazing land. I am 29 years old, I have never been married, and my favorite food is my mother's apple pie, though I have not had it in 7 years since she passed." Despite her misery, Priscilla felt her lips twitch slightly. That was very thorough. "Your turn," Ethan said, settling back in his chair. Priscilla took a shallow breath, trying to gather enough energy to speak. "Priscilla Vance. I work as a seamstress in Mrs. Henderson's shop." I am from Ohio originally, came west 8 months ago after my father died. He was a teacher, and after he was gone, there was nothing keeping me there. My aunt lives in Cheyenne and wrote to say there were opportunities for skilled seamstresses in the territory, so I came. I am 22, never been married either, and I cannot remember what my favorite food is because everything tastes like dust right now. The taste will come back when you are better, Ethan assured her. Are you hungry? Doc Harrison said you should eat whenever you are able, even if it is just broth. I have some chicken broth warming on the stove right now, in fact. At the mention of food, Priscilla became aware of a hollow, aching sensation in her stomach, though the thought of actually eating made her feel vaguely nauseous. I do not know if I can. How about we try? Ethan suggested, standing up and moving toward what Priscilla now realized was a small kitchen area in the corner of the one-room house. Even a few spoonfuls will help build your strength back up. He returned a moment later with a steaming bowl and a spoon, settling himself back in the chair and leaning forward. Priscilla tried to lift her arm to take the bowl from him, but her hand trembled so badly she could not even hold it steady in the air. I cannot, she said, frustration and embarrassment coloring her voice. My arms will not work properly. That is the fever and being bedridden for 3 days, Ethan said calmly. Your strength will return, but it will take time. For now, let me help. Before Priscilla could protest, he had dipped the spoon into the broth and was holding it carefully to her lips. The rich, savory smell made her stomach clench with sudden hunger, and she parted her lips to accept the broth. It was warm and comforting, sliding down her raw throat with surprising ease. Ethan waited patiently while she swallowed, then offered her another spoonful. This is humiliating, Priscilla murmured after the third spoonful. This is surviving, Ethan corrected gently. There is no shame in needing help when you are sick. We all need help sometimes. They fell into a rhythm, Ethan patiently feeding her small spoonfuls of broth and waiting between each one to make sure she could handle it. Priscilla found herself studying his face as he concentrated on his task, noting the way his brow furrowed slightly when he was making sure not to spill, and the gentle way he handled the spoon despite his large, work-roughened hands. He had the careful manner of someone who was used to dealing with fragile things, which seemed at odds with his obvious strength and the calloused hands of a working rancher. Why are you doing this? She asked after she had managed perhaps half the bowl and her exhaustion was making it hard to swallow anymore. You do not know me. You could have just left me at the infirmary with Doc Harrison. Ethan set the bowl down on the small table beside the bed and met her eyes directly. When I was 18, I got pneumonia while I was out on a cattle drive down in Texas. We were 3 days from the nearest town, and I was so sick I could not sit a horse. The trail boss could have left me there with a little food and water and sent someone back for me later. But instead, he had 2 of the other cowboys rig up a travois, and they took turns pulling me along with them. It slowed the whole drive down by nearly a week, cost them money and time, and they did it anyway because that is what decent people do. They take care of each other. And you recovered, Priscilla said softly. Obviously, Ethan replied with a slight smile. And the trail boss, a man named William Garrett, told me that the best way to repay that kindness was to pass it on to someone else who needed it someday. So when I saw you falling in the street, there was not even a question in my mind about what I needed to do. Priscilla felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her illness. She had grown used to relying only on herself in the months since her father's death, used to the loneliness of making her own way in the world. The idea that someone would go to such lengths for a stranger was almost overwhelming. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes stinging with tears that she blamed on the fever. I do not know how I will repay you. Get better, Ethan said simply. That is all the repayment I need. Over the next several days, Priscilla slowly became more aware of the small rhythms of life in Ethan's house. She learned that he rose before dawn every morning and rode out to his ranch to oversee the day's work before returning in the late afternoon to check on her. She learned that he was a surprisingly good cook, capable of making not just broth, but also soft scrambled eggs, tender biscuits, and a beef stew that made her mouth water despite her lingering lack of appetite. She learned that he read in the evenings, often aloud to her when she was too weak to hold a book herself, and that his tastes ran toward adventure stories and historical accounts of the Western territories. She also learned that he was patient beyond measure, never showing frustration when she needed help with the most basic and embarrassing tasks, never making her feel like a burden even though she knew she was disrupting his entire life. He continued to spoon-feed her broth and other soft foods 3 times a day, always waiting between spoonfuls, always making sure she was comfortable, always treating her with a gentle respect that made her heart ache in ways she could not quite define. By the end of the first week, Priscilla could sit up in bed for short periods without feeling like she might faint, though her arms still trembled with weakness whenever she tried to use them for any length of time. Ethan had propped pillows behind her back one afternoon, and she was watching him move around the small house with the easy efficiency of someone comfortable in his own space. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, wanting to fill the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Ethan glanced over from where he was stirring something on the stove. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Priscilla said. "I have never been on a real ranch before. The closest I have come is seeing cattle drives pass through town." Ethan smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face into something much younger and more open. He left the stove and came to sit in his usual chair beside the bed, settling in as though preparing for a long conversation. "I have about 800 acres of grazing land," he began, running along the Laramie River about 2 miles northwest of town. "The land is not as flat as what I grew up with in Texas, but the grass is good and there is plenty of water for the cattle. Right now I am running about 400 head of cattle, mostly crossbreeds that do well in the Wyoming climate. I have a small house out there, bigger than this one but still just one room with a loft. There is a barn for the horses, a bunkhouse for the men who work for me during the busy seasons, and various outbuildings for equipment and supplies." "How many men work for you?" Priscilla asked, genuinely curious. "Depends on the season," Ethan replied. "Right now, just 2 full-time hands, Jack Murphy and Samuel White. Jack is about 50, been working cattle his whole life, came up from Texas with me 5 years ago. Samuel is younger, maybe 24, local boy from Cheyenne who knows the territory better than I do. During spring roundup and fall drives, I hire on maybe 6 or 8 more temporary hands. During the winter, sometimes it is just me out there unless the weather gets particularly bad." "Is it lonely?" The question slipped out before Priscilla could stop it, and she felt her cheeks warm slightly. Ethan considered this for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I have always been comfortable with my own company, and the work keeps me busy enough that I do not often have time to dwell on it. But yes, there are moments, especially in the deep winter when I might not see another soul for days at a time, when the silence gets heavy." "Is that why you keep this house in town?" "Partly," Ethan said, "though mostly it is practical. When I need to meet with buyers or conduct business at the bank or get supplies, it is useful to have a place to stay overnight rather than making the ride back and forth in one day. And during the worst of the winter storms, sometimes it is impossible to get back to the ranch, so I need a place to shelter." "It seems like a hard life," Priscilla observed. "It is," Ethan agreed without hesitation, "but it is mine. Every fence post I set, every calf born on my land, every dollar earned from selling my cattle, it all belongs to me. No one can take it away, no one can tell me how to run things." After growing up working on other people's ranches, following other people's orders, that freedom is worth every hardship. There was a passion in his voice when he talked about the ranch that made Priscilla smile despite her lingering weakness. She understood that feeling, that need for independence and self-determination. It was part of what had driven her to leave Ohio and make the journey west, despite the dangers and uncertainties. "I think I understand that," she said softly. When I decided to leave Ohio and come to the territory, everyone told me I was being foolish. They said a young woman alone would never survive out here, that I should find a husband to take care of me instead, but I did not want to be taken care of. I wanted to make my own way, earn my own money, build my own life. And have you, Ethan asked, built your own life here, I mean? Priscilla thought about her small room at the boarding house, her work at Mrs. Henderson's shop, the quiet satisfaction of completing a difficult alteration or creating a dress from scratch. I am starting to, she said. It has only been 6 months, but yes, I think I am building something, or I was before this happened. You still are, Ethan said firmly. This is just a setback, not an ending. You will recover and go back to your work and your life. Mrs. Henderson might not hold my position for me, Priscilla said, voicing a worry that had been nagging at her whenever she had the energy to think about the future. She needs someone reliable, and I have been gone for over a week already. I sent word to her through Doc Harrison on the 2nd day, Ethan said. Let her know that you were seriously ill and would return to work as soon as you were able. Doc Harrison vouched for the severity of your condition. If she is any kind of reasonable employer, she will understand. Priscilla felt a rush of gratitude so strong it brought tears to her eyes again. You did that for me, of course, Ethan said, looking slightly puzzled by her emotional reaction. I could not let you lose your livelihood on top of everything else. You are a very kind man, Ethan Dalton, Priscilla said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan looked uncomfortable with the praise, shifting in his chair and clearing his throat. I am just doing what anyone would do. No, Priscilla said firmly, even though the effort of speaking with such conviction tired her. Most people would not do a fraction of what you have done. You have opened your home, cared for a stranger, sacrificed your time and your privacy, and you have done it all without complaint or expectation of anything in return. That is not what everyone does. That is exceptional. Ethan's cheeks colored slightly and he stood up abruptly, moving back toward the stove. The stew is ready, he said, clearly deflecting. Are you hungry enough to try some? Priscilla let him change the subject, recognizing that he was genuinely uncomfortable with her gratitude. But as she watched him ladle stew into a bowl and return to feed her with the same patient care he had shown all week, she felt something shift in her chest. It was not just gratitude anymore, though that was certainly part of it. It was something warmer, something that made her hyper-aware of the careful way his fingers held the spoon, the gentleness in his dark eyes when he looked at her, the deep timbre of his voice when he asked if the temperature of the food was comfortable. She was starting to care for this quiet, serious cowboy in ways that had nothing to do with the fact that he was keeping her alive. By the middle of the 2nd week, Priscilla could stay sitting up for several hours at a time, though she still could not stand without her legs threatening to give out. Her appetite was returning in earnest, and she found herself actually looking forward to meals rather than simply enduring them. The cough that had plagued her was fading and the fever had broken completely. Doc Harrison, who visited every few days to check on her progress, declared that she was through the worst of it and would make a full recovery with continued rest and good nutrition. You are fortunate, Doc Harrison said as he packed up his medical bag after one such visit. This strain of influenza has killed 3 people in the territory in the past month, including a healthy man half again your age. Whatever Ethan has been doing, it is working. Keep it up. After the doctor left, Ethan helped Priscilla move from the bed to the chair by the window, supporting her weight easily as her shaking legs adjusted to being upright. It was the first time she had been out of bed in nearly 2 weeks, and the change of perspective was almost overwhelming. Through the window, she could see a slice of Fort Laramie's Main Street, people going about their daily business, horses and wagons passing by. The normalcy of it was both comforting and strange. I feel like I have been in a different world, Priscilla said, watching a woman in a blue dress hurry past with a basket over her arm. And now I am seeing the real one again through glass. Ethan had settled himself on the edge of the bed since she was now occupying his usual chair. It will feel more real when you can walk out there again, he said, which should be soon the way you are progressing. I hope so, Priscilla said. As much as I appreciate everything you have done, I know you need your life back. You cannot keep sleeping in that chair every night. Ethan had indeed been sleeping in the chair, or sometimes on the floor with a bedroll, refusing to take the bed even when Priscilla was well enough to argue about it. She suspected he was not getting nearly enough rest, though he never complained. I am fine, Ethan said, which was exactly what she expected him to say. Do not worry about me. Someone should, Priscilla said softly. You spend all your time worrying about everyone else. Ethan met her eyes, and for a moment something passed between them, a connection that made Priscilla's breath catch in her throat. Then Ethan looked away, clearing his throat. Are you hungry? He asked. It is about time for supper. They fell back into their established routine, but something had changed. Priscilla found herself watching Ethan more closely, noticing things she had been too sick to pay attention to before. The way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size. The way he hummed tunelessly under his breath when he was cooking. The way his whole face softened when he smiled, which was happening more often as she recovered. The way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her heart skip. She was falling for him. The realization hit her one evening as he was reading aloud from a book of frontier tales, his deep voice bringing the adventures to life. She was falling for Ethan Dalton, this quiet cowboy who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return, and she had no idea what to do about it. The problem was complicated by the fact that Priscilla had no idea how Ethan felt about her. He was unfailingly kind and attentive, but he treated her with a respectful distance that suggested he saw his role as purely that of a caretaker. He never said anything inappropriate, never touched her beyond what was necessary to help her, never gave any indication that he thought of her as anything more than a patient he was responsible for. Maybe that was all she was to him. The thought was depressing, but Priscilla tried to be realistic. Ethan was a successful rancher, handsome and capable, exactly the sort of man who could have his pick of women in the territory. Why would he be interested in a seamstress from Ohio who had collapsed in the street and spent 2 weeks being a burden on his hospitality? Still, she could not quite make herself stop hoping every time he smiled at her, or when their hands accidentally brushed as he handed her a cup of water, or when he stayed up late into the night talking with her because she could not sleep and he did not want her to be alone with her thoughts. By the beginning of the 3rd week, Priscilla could stand on her own, though her legs were still weak and unsteady. Ethan had her practice walking back and forth across the small house several times a day, always staying close enough to catch her if she fell, but far enough to let her build her strength independently. It was frustrating work, and more than once Priscilla found herself blinking back tears of exhaustion and aggravation at her own weakness. I feel like a newborn foal, she said after one particularly difficult session, lowering herself carefully back into the chair by the window. All wobbly legs and no coordination. You are doing well, Ethan assured her. You have come a long way in just 3 weeks. It does not feel like it, Priscilla said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. I am so tired of being weak and helpless. I want to be myself again. You will be, Ethan said. He crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level, his expression serious. Priscilla, you nearly died. Your body needs time to heal completely. Pushing yourself too hard now could set back your recovery. I know, Priscilla said, taking a deep breath to calm herself. I know you are right. I am just not very good at being patient. I had not noticed, Ethan said dryly, but his eyes were warm with amusement. Priscilla laughed despite herself, and the tension in her chest eased slightly. I suppose I have been a difficult patient. Not at all, Ethan said, standing up again. You have been remarkable, actually. I have seen grown men turn into crying children when they are sick, but you have handled all of this with more grace than anyone could reasonably expect. The sincerity in his voice made Priscilla's cheeks warm, and she looked down at her hands. I have had a good nurse, she said softly. When she looked up again, Ethan was watching her with that same unreadable expression she had caught glimpses of before. This time he did not look away immediately, and Priscilla felt her heart begin to beat faster. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words, and she found herself leaning slightly forward without consciously deciding to move. Then Ethan took a step back, breaking whatever spell had been forming. "I should get started on supper," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Are you hungry?" Priscilla felt the loss of the moment like a physical thing, but she forced herself to smile and nod. "Yes, thank you." As Ethan moved toward the kitchen area, Priscilla turned to look out the window, her mind churning. Had she imagined the connection between them, or was Ethan deliberately keeping his distance? And if so, why? Was he simply being respectful of her vulnerability? Or did he not feel the same pull she did? She wished desperately that she could read him better, understand what was going on behind those serious dark eyes. But Ethan kept his emotions close, and Priscilla had no idea how to reach past his careful walls. That night, after Ethan had fed her supper and they had spent a comfortable hour with him reading aloud while she mended one of his shirts that she had insisted she was strong enough to work on, Priscilla found herself unable to sleep. The moon was full outside the window, casting silver light across the floor, and her mind kept circling back to the moment earlier when she had thought, just for a second, that Ethan might lean closer instead of pulling away. "Are you all right?" Ethan's voice came from the darkness near the door where he had arranged his bedroll. "I can hear you moving around." "I am fine," Priscilla said, then reconsidered. "No, actually I am not. Can we talk?" She heard Ethan shift, and then he was moving across the room to light the small lantern on the table, keeping the flame low. He dragged the chair closer to the bed and sat down, looking at her with concern. "What is wrong? Are you feeling ill again?" "No, nothing like that," Priscilla said. She took a breath, trying to figure out how to say what was on her mind without completely humiliating herself. "Ethan, I need to know something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right," he said slowly, his expression growing wary. "Why are you really doing all of this?" Priscilla asked. "And please do not say it is just because someone helped you once when you were sick. This has gone far beyond repaying an old debt. You have appended your entire life for 3 weeks to take care of a stranger. There has to be more to it than that." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as though he was trying to decide what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "When you collapsed in the street, I caught you before you hit the ground," he said. "And for just a second, before I even realized who you were or what was happening, I looked down at your face and I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Then I realized you were burning up with fever and barely conscious, and all I could think about was making sure you survived." Priscilla's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan," he held up a hand, stopping her, "let me finish. I brought you here because it was the right thing to do, that part is true. But I have stayed, I have cared for you. I have rearranged my entire life around making sure you recover, because somewhere in the first few days, I realized that I needed you to survive. Not because of some debt or obligation, but because I could not stand the thought of you not being in the world anymore." "Why did you not say anything?" Priscilla whispered, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Because you have been sick," Ethan said, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. "Because you have been vulnerable and dependent on me, and it would have been wrong to put that kind of pressure on you while you were in such a state. I did not want you to feel like you owed me anything, or like you had to return feelings you might not have just because I was taking care of you." "And now?" Priscilla asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Now you are getting better," Ethan said. "Soon you will be well enough to go back to your own life, back to your boarding house and your work, and I will go back to my ranch. And we will probably see each other occasionally in town, and we will be friendly and polite, and that will be the end of it." "What if I do not want that to be the end of it?" The words came out before Priscilla could second-guess them, bold and clear in the quiet room. Ethan went very still. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have spent the past week trying to convince myself that what I was feeling was just gratitude or some kind of emotional dependence brought on by being sick," Priscilla said, the words tumbling out in a rush now that she had started. "But it is not. It is not gratitude, Ethan. It is you. The way you hum when you cook, and the way you read adventure stories with so much enthusiasm, and the way you have never once made me feel like a burden even though I know I have been. The way you are so careful and gentle despite being so strong. The way you talk about your ranch like it is a living thing you love. It is all of it, all of you, and I do not want this to end when I get better. The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch for an eternity. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Priscilla felt her courage begin to waver. Had she misread everything? Was he trying to figure out how to let her down gently? Then Ethan stood up abruptly, and for a horrible moment, Priscilla thought he was going to walk away. Instead, he moved to the edge of the bed and sat down, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and cupped her face in his rough, gentle hands. "Priscilla," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been half in love with you since the first week, when you apologized for being trouble even though you could barely speak. I have been fully in love with you since the moment you asked me to tell you about my ranch and actually cared about the answer. And I have been terrified for the past week that you would get better and walk out of my life before I found the courage to tell you any of this. Then we have both been fools," Priscilla said, her own hands coming up to cover his where they rested against her cheeks. "Wasting time being scared when we could have been honest with each other. Can I kiss you?" Ethan asked, his thumb brushing gently across her cheekbone. "I know you are still recovering, and if it is too much." "Ethan," Priscilla interrupted, a smile tugging at her lips despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Stop talking and kiss me." He did, leaning in slowly and pressing his lips to hers with a tenderness that made her heart ache. It was a gentle kiss, careful of her lingering weakness, but it was filled with all the emotion they had both been holding back. Priscilla felt warmth spread through her entire body, chasing away the last remnants of her illness and replacing it with something infinitely better. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing slightly harder, Ethan rested his forehead against hers and let out a shaky laugh. "I have been wanting to do that for so long," he admitted. "Then do it again," Priscilla said, and he did, this time with a little more confidence and a little less restraint. By the time they separated again, Priscilla was dizzy in the best possible way, and Ethan's eyes were bright with happiness. "You should rest," Ethan said, though he made no move to pull away from her. "Doc Harrison would have my head if he knew I was keeping you up all night. I will rest better now than I have in days," Priscilla said truthfully, "knowing that you feel the same way I do." Ethan smiled, a full genuine smile that transformed his entire face, and pressed another quick kiss to her forehead before reluctantly standing up. "Sleep," he ordered gently. "We will figure out everything else tomorrow. Everything else." Priscilla asked, though her exhaustion was finally catching up with her now that the emotional intensity of the conversation was fading. "Everything," Ethan confirmed. "What happens next, where we go from here, all of it. But right now, you need to sleep and continue healing." Priscilla wanted to argue, wanted to stay awake and talk more, but her eyelids were growing heavy and her body was sinking into the mattress. "Stay close," she murmured as sleep began to pull her under. "Always," Ethan promised, and it was the last thing she heard before dreams claimed her. The next morning, Priscilla woke to find sunlight streaming through the window and Ethan sitting in his usual chair beside the bed, watching her with a soft expression that made her remember the previous night's conversation was real, not just a fever dream. She smiled at him and he smiled back, and everything felt different in the best possible way. "Good morning," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," Priscilla said honestly. "Better than I have felt in weeks." "Good enough to try walking to the table for breakfast?" Ethan asked. "I thought we could eat together like civilized people for once, instead of me feeding you in bed." "I would like that," Priscilla said, touched by the gesture. With Ethan's help, she made her way slowly across the room to the small table, sinking into one of the chairs with relief. Her legs were still weak, but they were getting stronger every day. Ethan served breakfast, simple fare of eggs and biscuits, but Priscilla enjoyed it more than any meal she could remember. They talked as they ate, the conversation flowing easily now that the tension of unspoken feelings had been lifted. Ethan told her about the work piling up at his ranch that he needed to attend to soon, and Priscilla told him about her plans to return to work at Mrs. Henderson's shop once she was strong enough. "I will need to go back to the boarding house eventually," Priscilla said, though the thought made her oddly sad. She had grown accustomed to this small house, to having Ethan's steady presence nearby. "I am probably a week or two behind on rent already." "About that," Ethan said, setting down his coffee cup. "I paid your rent through the end of next month." Priscilla stared at him. "You what?" "I paid your rent," Ethan repeated, looking slightly defensive. "I could not let you lose your room on top of everything else. Consider it another part of your medical care." "Ethan, I cannot let you do that," Priscilla protested. "You have already done so much. Let me pay you back once I start working again." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Priscilla, I am not a wealthy man by any means, but I am comfortable. The ranch does well enough that I can afford to help a friend without it causing hardship. Please, let me do this." Priscilla wanted to argue, her pride bristling at accepting more charity, but she could see from Ethan's expression that this was important to him. "Thank you," she said finally. "I do not deserve you. You deserve so much more than what I can give you," Ethan said quietly, "but I am going to spend a good long time trying anyway if you will let me." The sincerity in his voice made Priscilla's throat tighten with emotion. "I will let you," she promised. "As long as you let me do the same for you." Over the next week, Priscilla continued to grow stronger. She could walk around the small house without assistance now, though she still tired easily and needed frequent rests. Ethan had to return to his ranch for longer periods to deal with accumulated business, but he came back every evening and stayed through the night, unwilling to leave her alone for too long. During the days when he was gone, Doc Harrison or his wife would stop by to check on Priscilla and bring her lunch, ensuring she was never completely without help if she needed it. The time apart during the days made the evenings together even more precious. Ethan would return dusty and tired from the ranch, and Priscilla would have usually attempted some small task like preparing vegetables for stew or mending his shirts. They would work together on supper, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity, and then they would sit together by the lamp and talk for hours. They talked about everything and nothing. Priscilla told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her father's love of books and teaching, about the loneliness after her mother died when she was young. Ethan told her about growing up on various ranches in Texas, about the hard work and harder men, about the dream he had carried for years of having his own place. They talked about their hopes for the future, their fears, their dreams, and they touched constantly and naturally. Ethan would reach across the table to take her hand while they talked. Priscilla would lean against his shoulder when they sat side by side. He would brush hair back from her face, and she would rest her palm against his chest to feel his heartbeat. It was as though they were making up for the weeks of careful distance, learning the language of physical affection with each other. One evening, about a month after Priscilla had first collapsed, Ethan arrived back at the house with a serious expression that made her immediately concerned. "What is wrong?" she asked as he came through the door. "Did something happen at the ranch?" "No, the ranch is fine," Ethan assured her. He crossed to where she was sitting by the window and crouched down in front of her, taking both her hands in his. "Priscilla, we need to talk about what happens next." Priscilla's stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous," Ethan said quickly. "Just important. You are almost fully recovered now. Doc Harrison said today that you could probably return to work within a few days if you take it easy at first, which means it is time for you to move back to your boarding house and resume your life." "Oh," Priscilla said, the word coming out smaller than she intended. "I suppose you are right. You need your house and your life back." "That is not what I want," Ethan said firmly. "Priscilla, I do not want you to leave. I want you to stay with me, permanently." Priscilla's heart began to race. "Ethan, what are you saying?" "I am saying this all wrong," Ethan muttered, then took a deep breath and met her eyes directly. "Priscilla Vance, I love you. I know we have only known each other for a month, and I know that most of that time you have been sick and dependent on me, which is not the most romantic foundation for a relationship. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I know that I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I know that I want to come home every evening to you. I know that I want to build a life with you if you will have me. Are you asking me to marry you? Priscilla whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Yes, Ethan said simply. I am asking you to marry me. I am asking you to come live with me at the ranch and be my wife. I am asking you to take a chance on a cowboy who fell in love with you while feeding you soup and never wants to stop taking care of you, even though I know you do not need taking care of. Priscilla felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. Yes, she said. Yes, Ethan, I will marry you. I love you too, so much it terrifies me sometimes. Ethan let out a breath that sounded like relief and joy mixed together, then pulled her out of the chair and into his arms, holding her tightly. Priscilla buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid reality of his embrace. I do not have a ring yet, Ethan said into her hair. I wanted to ask you first before I presumed. We can go together to pick one out if you want. I do not need a ring right now, Priscilla said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. I just need you. Ethan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, his eyes were bright with happiness and desire. We should get married soon, he said. I do not want to wait months for a big wedding. Is that all right? That is more than all right, Priscilla agreed. I do not have family here to invite anyway, and I do not need a big celebration. I just need to become your wife. How about 2 weeks? Ethan suggested. That gives us time to get a license, find a preacher, and for you to make a dress if you want to, and it gives me time to make the house at the ranch more livable for 2 people. 2 weeks sounds perfect, Priscilla said, and kissed him again to seal the agreement. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Priscilla returned to work at Mrs. Henderson's shop, grateful to find that her employer had indeed held her position and was sympathetic to her situation. When she explained that she was getting married and would be leaving to live at Ethan's ranch, Mrs. Henderson congratulated her warmly and even helped her create a simple but beautiful wedding dress in ivory silk with delicate lace trim. Ethan spent the 2 weeks making improvements to the ranch house, enlisting Jack and Samuel's help to add a proper bedroom with a door for privacy, repair the roof, and build additional furniture. He came into town every evening, and he and Priscilla would have supper together at the local restaurant, then take long walks around Fort Laramie as she continued to rebuild her strength. People noticed, of course, and tongues wagged about the quick courtship, but neither of them cared. They were too happy, too focused on their future together to worry about gossip. Doc Harrison, when he heard the news, laughed and said he had predicted it from the first week. Any fool could see the way that boy looked at you, he told Priscilla. I am glad you both figured it out. On a crisp November morning in 1878, Priscilla Vance married Ethan Dalton in a simple ceremony at the small church in Fort Laramie. There were fewer than a dozen people in attendance, mostly Ethan's ranch hands and a few of Priscilla's acquaintances from the sewing shop, but it felt perfect. Priscilla wore her ivory dress and carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Ethan had ridden out to pick that morning. Ethan wore his best suit, looking handsome and slightly nervous as he waited for her at the altar. When Priscilla walked down the short aisle on Doc Harrison's arm, since her own father was gone, she saw Ethan's face transform with joy and love, and she knew she was making exactly the right choice. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told Ethan he could kiss his bride, he did so thoroughly enough to make several people in the small congregation chuckle. Afterward, there was a modest celebration at the local saloon, which had been cleaned up for the occasion. Priscilla found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom were genuinely happy for them. Jack Murphy, Ethan's older ranch hand, pulled her aside at one point and said gruffly, "You are good for him, Mrs. Dalton. I have never seen the boss so happy. Welcome to the family." Mrs. Dalton. Priscilla tested the name in her mind and found she loved the sound of it. As the sun began to set, Ethan collected his new wife and helped her into the wagon for the journey out to the ranch. Priscilla had seen the ranch only once before, when Ethan had taken her out there a few days ago to show her what would be her new home. It was beautiful in a rugged, practical way, with the house sitting on a slight rise overlooking the grazing land and the river winding through the distance like a silver ribbon. Now, arriving as Ethan's wife, it felt different. It felt like coming home. Ethan carried her over the threshold, a tradition he insisted on even though Priscilla protested she was perfectly capable of walking. He set her down gently in the middle of the main room, which looked different from her previous visit. There were curtains on the windows now, soft blue fabric that Ethan had clearly picked out himself. There were new cushions on the chairs, a colorful rag rug on the floor, and a vase of wildflowers on the table. Small touches that showed he had been thinking about making this place comfortable for her. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dalton," Ethan said softly, watching her take in the changes. "It is beautiful," Priscilla said, turning to look at him with tears in her eyes. "You did all of this for me." "For us," Ethan corrected. "This is our home now. I want you to feel like it is yours as much as it is mine." Priscilla crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving my life, for loving me, for giving me this." Ethan held her close, his lips brushing her temple. "Thank you for saying yes," he replied, "for taking a chance on me." They stood like that for a long moment, simply holding each other before Ethan pulled back slightly with a smile that was equal parts tender and heated. "We should probably eat something," he said. "I had Jack bring over some food earlier so we would not have to cook tonight." "Food sounds good," Priscilla agreed, though she was distracted by the way Ethan was looking at her. They had been careful and respectful during their brief courtship, limiting their physical affection to kisses and embraces. But now they were married, and the awareness of what that meant hung in the air between them like electricity. They ate the cold supper that Jack had provided, but neither of them had much appetite. The conversation was halting and filled with pauses, both of them too aware of each other and the night ahead. Finally, Ethan stood and held out his hand. "Come with me," he said gently. "I want to show you something." He led her to the new bedroom, which Priscilla had seen only briefly on her previous visit. Now, in the lamplight, she could see that he had made more changes here too. The bed was large and covered with a beautiful quilt in shades of blue and green. There were shelves on the wall, currently empty but clearly intended for her things. And on the small dresser, there was a framed photograph, the only personal item in the room. Priscilla moved closer to look at it, and saw it was a picture of her and Ethan, taken in town just a few days ago by a traveling photographer. "I wanted to make sure you knew this is our room," Ethan said from behind her. "Not mine that you are moving into, but ours that we are making together." Priscilla turned to face him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I love you so much," she said. "I do not think I can even find the words to tell you how much." "Then show me," Ethan said softly, reaching for her. Priscilla went into his arms willingly, and they kissed with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. Ethan's hands moved to the buttons of her dress, and Priscilla's fingers worked at his shirt, and they undressed each other slowly, taking time to explore and appreciate what they were revealing. When they finally came together in the big bed under the blue and green quilt, it was with tenderness and passion combined, a physical expression of the love they had declared in words. Ethan was careful with her, mindful that she was still recovering her full strength, but Priscilla showed him that she was much stronger than he thought. They made love with the awkwardness and enthusiasm of first times, learning each other's bodies and preferences, laughing at the occasional fumble and gasping at the moments of perfect connection. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Priscilla's head on Ethan's chest and his arms wrapped securely around her. She could hear his heart beating strong and steady beneath her ear, and she felt more at peace than she had in her entire life. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked softly, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "I am more than happy," Priscilla said. I did not even know I could feel this happy. When I collapsed in that street 6 weeks ago, I thought my life was over. I never imagined that it was actually just beginning." "Our life," Ethan corrected, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It is our life now, yours and mine together." "Together," Priscilla agreed and drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, safe and loved and home. The first months of married life at the ranch were an adjustment for both of them, but it was an adjustment they made together. Priscilla learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the constant work and the satisfaction of seeing tangible results from their efforts. She took over the cooking and household management, finding that she enjoyed creating a real home rather than just living in a rented room. She also continued her sewing, taking on commissions from people in Fort Laramie and the surrounding ranches, enjoying the creative work and the income it provided. Ethan learned to share his space and his life, to talk about his day and his concerns rather than keeping everything to himself. He learned that Priscilla was fully capable of helping with ranch work when she wanted to, and that she had opinions about how things should be done that were often quite good. He learned that coming home at the end of a hard day to find his wife waiting for him made every bit of work worthwhile. They had disagreements, of course, as any couple does. Priscilla wanted to take on more outside work than Ethan thought was wise given her still recovering health. Ethan had a tendency to make decisions about the ranch without consulting her, assuming she would not be interested. But they learned to communicate, to compromise, to put their partnership first even when it was difficult. Winter came hard that year, with heavy snows that sometimes kept them isolated at the ranch for days at a time. But Priscilla found she did not mind. She had everything she needed right here in this house with this man. They spent long evenings by the fire, Ethan reading aloud while Priscilla sewed, or simply talking about their dreams for the ranch and their future. They made love often, learning each other's bodies with increasing familiarity and pleasure, building a physical connection that matched their emotional bond. By spring, Priscilla was fully recovered from her illness. Her strength returned completely. She celebrated by helping Ethan with the spring roundup, riding out with him and the ranch hands to gather the cattle that had scattered during the winter. It was hard, exhausting work, but she loved being part of it, loved seeing Ethan in his element, commanding and capable on horseback. One evening during the roundup, after they had returned to the ranch house exhausted and dusty, Priscilla realized that her monthly courses were late. She had been so busy and distracted that she had not paid attention to the dates, but now, counting back, she realized she had missed them entirely. Her hand went to her stomach, wonder and excitement rushing through her. She waited until after supper to tell Ethan, when they were sitting together on the porch watching the sun set over the grazing land. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach, looking at him with barely contained joy. "I think I might be carrying our child," she said softly. Ethan went very still, his eyes widening. "Are you certain?" "Not completely," Priscilla admitted. "But I am very late, and I am never late. We should go see Doc Harrison to be sure, but yes, I think I am pregnant." Ethan's face broke into the widest smile Priscilla had ever seen from him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Priscilla asked, even though she could see the answer on his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Ethan said. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. "Priscilla, you have given me everything. A home, a partner, love, and now a child. I do not know what I did to deserve all of this, but I am grateful every single day." "We deserve each other," Priscilla said firmly. "We deserve this happiness. We have both worked hard enough for it." Doc Harrison confirmed the pregnancy a week later, pronouncing Priscilla healthy and the baby due in late autumn. Ethan immediately became overprotective, trying to limit Priscilla's activities and insisting she rest more. Priscilla had to remind him repeatedly that pregnancy was not an illness, and that she was perfectly capable of continuing with her normal routine for many months yet. "I almost lost you once," Ethan said one night when she chided him for trying to carry water she was perfectly capable of carrying herself. I cannot go through that again. Let me take care of you. You do take care of me, Priscilla assured him, softening at the genuine fear in his voice. Every single day, but you also have to trust that I know my own limits and that I will ask for help when I need it. Can you do that? Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. I will try, but if you start to feel weak or sick, I will tell you immediately, Priscilla promised. I learned my lesson about ignoring warning signs when I collapsed in the street last fall. I will not take chances with our baby's health or my own. As her pregnancy progressed, Priscilla found herself thinking often about that day in the street, about how dramatically her life had changed in the span of a few moments. If Ethan had not been there to catch her, if he had not taken her in and cared for her, if they had not fallen in love during those weeks of illness and recovery, none of this would exist. She would not have this home, this husband, this child growing inside her. It was strange to think that something as terrible as the flu had led to something so beautiful. But then, that seemed to be the way life worked sometimes. The bad and the good all tangled up together, leading to outcomes you could never predict. The pregnancy was relatively easy, for which Priscilla was deeply grateful. She had some morning sickness in the early months, and she tired more easily as she grew larger, but overall she felt healthy and strong. Ethan remained protective, but learned to channel it into useful ways, taking over the heaviest chores and making sure she always had comfortable places to rest when she needed them. On a cold November evening, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Priscilla went into labor. Ethan rode like hell to fetch Doc Harrison while Mrs. Harrison, the doctor's wife who attended most births in the area, stayed with Priscilla and helped her through the early stages. When Ethan returned with the doctor, his face was white with fear, but he took his place at Priscilla's side and held her hand through the entire ordeal, murmuring encouragement and support, even when she crushed his fingers during contractions. Their son was born just after midnight, coming into the world with a lusty cry that made both his parents laugh with relief. Doc Harrison pronounced him healthy and perfect, a good-sized baby with a strong set of lungs. When he placed the baby in Priscilla's arms, she looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Priscilla and his eyes fixed on his son with an expression of absolute wonder. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Priscilla, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Priscilla asked, looking up at her husband. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Ethan smiled. "I was thinking William," he said. "After the trail boss who saved my life when I was 18, the man who taught me about helping others, it seems fitting." "William Dalton," Priscilla said, testing the name. "I love it. William it is." Little William proved to be a healthy, happy baby who slept reasonably well and ate with enthusiasm. Priscilla recovered quickly from the birth, and within a few weeks she was back to her normal routine, albeit with a baby strapped to her chest or napping in a cradle nearby. Ethan was a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son, talking to him constantly, even though William could not possibly understand the words yet. "You are going to teach him to love the ranch," Priscilla observed one evening, watching Ethan hold William and describe the day's work in detail to the infant. "I am going to teach him to love many things," Ethan corrected. "The ranch, yes, but also books and learning like your father taught you. Hard work and honesty and kindness. And I am going to teach him that the most important thing in life is finding someone to love who loves you back, the way I found you." Priscilla felt tears sting her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "You are going to be an amazing father," she said. "You already are." As William grew from an infant to a toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Ethan expanded his herd and bought additional grazing land. Priscilla's sewing business grew as well, and she found herself training young women from town who wanted to learn the trade. They built an addition onto the house, adding more bedrooms and a proper workroom for Priscilla's sewing. Life was full and busy and good. When William was 2 years old, Priscilla discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, with dark hair like her father and eyes that would eventually settle into a warm hazel. William was fascinated by his new sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to bedtime stories. 2 years after Grace came another daughter whom they named Hope. And 2 years after that, a second son they named Samuel, after Ethan's ranch hand who had become a close friend over the years. Their house was full of noise and laughter and life. Some days were harder than others, especially when all 4 children seemed determined to test their parents' patience simultaneously. But even on the hardest days, Priscilla and Ethan would meet each other's eyes across the chaos and smile, remembering where they had started and how far they had come. On their 10th wedding anniversary, after they had put all 4 children to bed and finally had a quiet moment together, Ethan pulled Priscilla into his arms on the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" he asked, holding her close. "If you had not gotten sick, or if I had not been there to catch you, or if Doc Harrison had insisted on keeping you at the infirmary." "Sometimes," Priscilla admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. We cannot change the past, and honestly, I would not want to. Everything that happened, good and bad, led us here, led us to this family, this life, this love. I fell in love with you while feeding you soup," Ethan said, a smile in his voice. "That has to be one of the strangest courtship stories anyone has ever had." "It is our story," Priscilla said, tilting her head up to kiss him. "And I would not change a single word of it." They stood together on the porch as the stars came out overhead, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful together. Behind them, in the house full of sleeping children, lay the proof of their love and their commitment. And ahead of them stretched years of future, full of challenges and joys they could not yet imagine but would face together. The flu had left her too weak to stand. The cowboy had spoon-fed her broth until she could, and in doing so, they had saved each other in ways that went far beyond physical healing. They had found love, built a family, and created a home that would stand for generations. 20 years after that first day in the street, Priscilla stood on the same porch, now with silver threading through her hair and laugh lines around her eyes. William was 20, working the ranch alongside his father and courting a nice girl from town. Grace was 18, teaching school in Fort Laramie and writing stories in her spare time. Hope was 16, with a talent for horses that rivaled Ethan's. And Samuel was 14, still figuring out who he wanted to be but showing promise in everything he tried. Ethan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. His hair was more gray than dark now, and his face bore the weathering of decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were still the same warm brown that had watched over her during her illness all those years ago. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Priscilla said, leaning back against him. "How much has changed, how much has stayed the same, how grateful I am for all of it. Even the flu," Ethan teased. "Especially the flu," Priscilla said, turning in his arms to face him, "because it brought me you. And you brought me this life, this family, this love. So yes, even the terrible flu that almost killed me, I am grateful for all of it." Ethan kissed her, slow and sweet, a kiss that still held all the passion and devotion of their early days but was now tempered with the deeper connection of 2 decades together. When they pulled apart, he smiled at her with all the love in the world. "Here is to the next 20 years, he said. "And beyond," Priscilla agreed, "always together no matter what comes." They had started with a moment of weakness and a bowl of broth. They had built a lifetime of strength and love. And they would continue building it, day by day, until their story reached its natural end, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the legacy of a love that began in the most unlikely way. In the distance, the sun was setting over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. The cattle were settling for the night, and from inside the house came the sound of their children's voices raised in laughter over some shared joke. Priscilla looked out over the land that had become her home and felt nothing but contentment. This was everything she had never known she wanted. This was happiness, hard-won and deeply cherished. This was love in all its messy, complicated, beautiful glory. This was her life, and she would not change a single moment of it. Years continued to pass in the comfortable rhythm of ranch life. William married his sweetheart, a rancher's daughter named Margaret, and brought her to live at the ranch, building a small house on the property where they started their own family. Grace married a lawyer from Cheyenne and moved to the city, but she visited often with her 2 children. Hope married the veterinarian who had settled in Fort Laramie, and they made their home in town, but remained intimately involved in the ranch's operations. Samuel, after years of trying different paths, discovered a talent for breeding horses and developed a successful business alongside the cattle operation. Ethan and Priscilla became grandparents 7 times over, delighting in the chaos and joy of family gatherings where 3 generations filled the ranch house with noise and laughter. They grew older together gracefully, Ethan's back developing the ache that came from decades of physical labor, Priscilla's hands sometimes stiff from years of detailed sewing work. But they faced each challenge together, adjusting to the changes that age brought with humor and patience. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, they renewed their vows in the same small church where they had married 3 decades earlier. Priscilla wore a dress she had made herself, elegant silver silk that matched the color her hair had become. Ethan wore his best suit, still broad-shouldered despite his 60 years. When they spoke their vows again, promising to love and cherish each other for whatever time they had left, there was not a dry eye in the church. That evening, back at the ranch with their family around them, William stood to make a toast. He raised his glass and looked at his parents with affection and respect. "To my parents," he said, "who taught us that love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about showing up every day, even when things are hard. It is about feeding someone soup when they are too weak to feed themselves and never asking for anything in return. It is about building a life together one day at a time with patience and kindness and unwavering commitment. Mom, Dad, you have shown us what real love looks like, and we are all better people for it." The family erupted in agreement, glasses raised, and Priscilla found herself crying happy tears as Ethan pulled her close and kissed her temple, just as he had done countless times over the decades. Later that night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Ethan and Priscilla sat together on their porch one more time, wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air. The stars overhead were the same stars that had shone on them 30 years ago and would continue to shine long after they were gone. "We have had a good life," Ethan said softly, "better than I ever dreamed possible." "We have," Priscilla agreed, "and we are not done yet. We still have more adventures ahead of us." "Slower adventures," Ethan said with a laugh. "My adventuring days of sleeping on the ground and riding for hours are behind me." "Good," Priscilla said. "I prefer the kind of adventures we can have in comfortable chairs with our grandchildren on our laps." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped together, watching the night deepen around them. After 30 years together, they did not always need words. The silence between them was full of understanding and companionship, as much a part of their relationship as the conversations and laughter. "Priscilla," Ethan said eventually, his voice thoughtful, "do you ever regret not having a more conventional courtship? Dances and picnics and proper courting rituals?" Priscilla turned to look at him, seeing in his weathered face the same man who had caught her when she fell, who had patiently fed her soup, who had loved her through sickness and health. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Our story is unconventional, yes, but it is ours, and I would not trade it for all the conventional courtships in the world." Ethan smiled and squeezed her hand. "Good, because I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment of worry when your fever was so high, every night sleeping in that chair, every time I fed you broth and wondered if you would survive. I would do it all again for the chance to have this life with you." "You saved my life," Priscilla said, something she had told him many times but never grew tired of saying. You saved mine right back, Ethan replied, as he always did. You gave me purpose and love and family. You made a house into a home. You saved me from a lonely existence and gave me a full, rich life instead. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, then climbed into the bed they had shared for 30 years, curling together with the ease of long practice. Priscilla fell asleep listening to Ethan's heartbeat, steady and strong, the same rhythm that had comforted her during her illness 3 decades ago and had been her constant companion ever since. More years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow as such years do. They lost friends to age and illness. They celebrated the births of great-grandchildren. They watched Fort Laramie grow from a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools and churches and paved streets. They saw the old ways of the West gradually give way to new technologies and new ideas. Some changes they welcomed and others they mourned. Through it all, they remained each other's constant. When Ethan's arthritis made it difficult for him to work on the ranch, Priscilla was there to help him adjust to a more supervisory role and to ease his frustration at his body's limitations. When Priscilla's eyesight began to fail, making her detailed sewing work impossible, Ethan was there to help her find new ways to be creative and useful. They supported each other through every transition, every loss, every challenge. On a warm spring afternoon, when Ethan was 75 and Priscilla was 68, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Ethan had been more tired lately, sleeping more, eating less. Doc Harrison's son, who had taken over his father's practice, had been coming by more frequently, his face grave with concern. But on this particular afternoon, Ethan seemed more himself, more present, and they enjoyed the sunshine and the sight of the ranch in spring bloom. "Do you remember," Ethan said suddenly, "that first morning after you finally understood that I had feelings for you? When we had breakfast together at the table for the first time?" "I remember," Priscilla said, smiling at the memory. "You were so nervous about whether I could actually walk that far. You were still so weak," Ethan said, "but you were determined. You have always been so determined about everything." "I learned from you," Priscilla said. "You never gave up on me, even when the fever was at its worst and Doc Harrison thought I might not make it. If you could be that stubborn about keeping me alive, I could be stubborn about recovering." Ethan chuckled, then his expression grew more serious. "Priscilla, I need you to know something. These past 46 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life. Every single day, even the hard ones, has been worthwhile because I spent them with you." Something in his tone made Priscilla's heart clench with concern. "Ethan." "I am just saying what is true," Ethan said, taking her hand. "I love you. I have loved you since I caught you falling in that street, and I will love you beyond whatever comes next. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "You are the best thing that ever happened to me too," Priscilla said, tears streaming down her face, though she could not have said exactly why. "I love you so much, Ethan." They sat together holding hands as the afternoon faded into evening, and when the family came by for their weekly dinner, they found them there, Ethan asleep with his head resting against Priscilla's shoulder. He looked peaceful, more relaxed than he had in weeks, but he did not wake up. The doctor said it was his heart, that it had simply stopped while he slept. There had been no pain, no struggle, just a quiet transition from sleep to something beyond. It was, everyone agreed, as gentle a death as anyone could hope for, especially for a man who had lived such a full and active life. But knowing it was peaceful did not make Priscilla's grief any less acute. She had lost her partner of 46 years, her best friend, the love of her life. The man who had saved her and whom she had saved in return. The father of her children and the grandfather of her grandchildren, half of her heart. The funeral was large, attended by people from all over the territory who had known Ethan and respected him. They told stories of his fairness as an employer, his honesty in business dealings, his willingness to help neighbors in need. But the story that meant the most to Priscilla was the one that Jack Murphy told, the now elderly ranch hand who had worked for Ethan for over 40 years. I remember when the boss brought Miss Priscilla to his house, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. She was so sick we thought she would die, but the boss, he never gave up. He sat by that bed day and night, feeding her broth spoonful by spoonful, talking to her, keeping her alive through sheer force of will. And I remember thinking, that is a man who knows how to love. That is a man who will give everything for the people he cares about. The boss lived that way his whole life, giving everything to his family and his friends and his community. And now we have to live up to his example. After the funeral, after the people had gone home and the food had been put away and the children had reluctantly returned to their own lives, Priscilla found herself alone in the ranch house for the first time in over 4 decades. The silence was deafening. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching things that Ethan had touched, remembering moments from their life together. The chair where he had sat feeding her soup, the bed where they had loved each other and conceived their children. The porch where they had spent countless evenings talking and dreaming and simply being together. In the bedroom, she found the photograph that had sat on the dresser for 46 years, the image of them as newlyweds. She picked it up carefully, tracing Ethan's face with one finger. "You kept your promise," she whispered to the photograph. "You loved me and cherished me every single day. You gave me everything, and now I have to figure out how to keep living without you." It was not easy. The weeks and months after Ethan's death were the hardest of Priscilla's life, harder even than the aftermath of her father's death, because she was older now and more aware of the permanence of loss. But her children rallied around her, insisting she not be alone, bringing her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to fill the quiet house with noise and life. William and Margaret moved into the ranch house with her, gently taking over the tasks that Ethan had handled while still treating Priscilla as the matriarch she was. Slowly, painfully, Priscilla adjusted to her new reality. She found ways to honor Ethan's memory while still living her own life. She started a scholarship fund in his name for young people from the territory who wanted to learn ranching. She gathered all of his stories and wrote them down so that future generations would know what kind of man he had been. She made sure the ranch continued to prosper, knowing that would have been what he wanted. And gradually, the acute pain of grief softened into a gentler sadness, a permanent ache but one she could live with. She found she could remember Ethan and smile instead of crying, could tell stories about their life together and feel joy at the memories rather than just loss. On what would have been their 50th anniversary, Priscilla made a pilgrimage to Fort Laramie's Main Street, to the exact spot where she had collapsed all those years ago. It was early October, almost the same time of year, and the air had the same crisp quality it had held that day. She stood on the dusty street and remembered the sensation of falling, of strong arms catching her, of looking up into concerned dark eyes and not knowing that she was seeing her future. "Thank you," she whispered to the memory of Ethan, to the universe, to whatever force had brought them together. "Thank you for that day. Thank you for catching me in every possible way." Priscilla lived for 7 more years after Ethan's death, years filled with family and love and the satisfaction of seeing the legacy they had built together continue to flourish. She met her great-great-grandchildren, tiny babies who carried forward the bloodline of the love story that had started with a bowl of soup and a patient cowboy. She saw the ranch grow and prosper under William's capable management. She saw her children and grandchildren live happy, productive lives, carrying forward the values she and Ethan had taught them. And when her own time came, on a cool autumn evening much like the one where Ethan had passed, she went peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by photographs of her family and the quilt that had covered her and Ethan's bed for 5 decades. Her last conscious thought was a sense of anticipation, a feeling that she was going toward something rather than away from something, going toward Ethan, she thought, going home. The family buried her next to Ethan under a large oak tree on the ranch property with a simple headstone that read, "Priscilla Dalton, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She lived with love." Next to it, Ethan's headstone read, "Ethan Dalton, beloved husband, father, grandfather." He loved with his whole heart. Between the two stones, the family placed a smaller marker with a simple inscription. He caught her when she fell, and they spent a lifetime falling in love. The ranch continued for generations, passing from William to his children to their children, each generation adding to the legacy while honoring the foundation that Ethan and Priscilla had built. The story of how it all began, with a young woman's collapse and a cowboy's compassion, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of how the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the air has that certain crisp quality and the light falls just right across the Wyoming plains, people claim they can see two figures sitting on the porch of the old ranch house. An older couple sitting close together, hands clasped, watching the sunset with expressions of perfect contentment. The figures are there for just a moment, barely long enough to register, and then they fade like morning mist. But those who see them always feel a sense of peace afterward, a reminder that love like theirs does not simply end when life does. It continues, woven into the land and the air and the very foundation of the place they built together. A testament to the power of compassion, patience, and unwavering devotion. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the very best, if we are lucky enough to find someone willing to feed us soup when we cannot feed ourselves, and wise enough to recognize that gift for what it truly is, the beginning of everything.